HR. HR legislation.
HR legislation.
HR. Federal. HR legislation. Federal. HR.
Federal legislation. Legislation.
HR legislation. HR federal legislation. Federal legislation. Federal legislation.
Legislation.
HR legislation.
HR legislation.
Legislation.
HR legislation. Federal legislation.
HR legislation. Federal HR legislation. HR federal legislation. HR
legislation. Federal legislation. Federal HR federal HR legislation.
Federal HR legislation. Federal legislation.
Legislation.
HR